This is a Mantua 040, and today we're going to be trying to restore it. So before that, let's go test this thing out, and then I'll give you a little bit of an overview of this whole project. So before we get started, I'll test this thing out, and you might be able to tell it won't be easy because the tender that actually picks up power is not actually connected. So what I'm going to do, because this is the way the tender wheels are oriented, is I'm going to touch the wire on the back of the engine directly to the left rail, and I will see if the thing does anything. So first off, I'll put some power into the track, and I will touch the wire to the rail. And it might be difficult to tell, but it is actually moving. I'll give it more power and put it back on. So yes, while it isn't moving very much, I can tell that everything in there is intact and it's actually functional, aside from the lack of the whole tender pickup setup. So let's take this thing back over to my desk and let's get to work on this ambitious project. So I've been looking at this engine, and I do actually have a plan of action before we get into this. I want to focus on the tender before I focus on the locomotive, and I'll show you why in a second. So I can obviously see that this wire is disconnected. That's one of the areas we'll focus on. I'll get to that in a minute. But the tender itself, looking underneath, has a bunch of problems. It's got some corrosion, and these trucks do not look like they pick up power very well. These axles look fairly rusted. These trucks are very corroded looking, and I don't believe much power would flow through there. So what I'm going to do is I've actually got some trucks and I've got some different Tyco axles that I put in. These are definitely not going to be the exact same style of truck. I believe these are for a more modern freight car, but they should serve the same purpose. And to go with these, instead of having the whole truck be metal, I've got some pickups off of a roundhouse engine that I've got. I don't know if these were off of an engine or a tender kit or something, but I've got a few spare of these, so I have just at least two to go on here. So my first plan of action is I'm going to go in and we're going to clean out this whole tender, replace the trucks on it. And the second thing is we're actually going to be using a different wire. I have this piece, which came off a Tyco Power Torque that I parted out a while ago, and it's got this good connector and a fairly decent looking wire. So I'm going to be reusing this wire, but before we solder it to the engine and go in there, I'm just going to use a spare, probably nut or something that I have laying around to lock this into place here and have the whatever tender connector go on here, the drawbar. So that'll be screwed underneath, so that can be moved more freely, and this one will stay locked into place. So once I've gotten those few things done with the tender, we're going to go into the engine, and there's a few things I want to tackle. So first off, and this will probably be the first thing I do, we're going to go through, give this thing a very basic cleaning, because this will obviously need a lot of work. It actually does run, as we saw, but there's definitely some areas of improvement needed in this drive system. Another thing I would like to do is I want to remove the smoke unit thing. I don't know if this is actually a smoke unit, but I don't really like them. So I want it to be off of this unit. And I also want to replace this wire completely, just completely unsolder it and replace it with this wire and just cut this down to size, strip it, tin it, and then just attach it where the other wire would have gone. So with that lengthy introduction out of the way, let's get to work on the thing. And our first task will be the tender, which I have already talked about. So the current problem is this one screw is stuck in place. I will also be looking for replacement screws briefly after I get this thing apart, and then we will go from there. So I'm going to get a bigger screwdriver, see if I can get this thing out. Alright, so now that that screw is off of there, I'm going to give you a little overview of the tender. I'm not planning to replace this horn coupler at all, but what I am going to do is I'm just going to clean off these little posts because that's really the only area where contact will seem to matter for this unit. And I also will clean off this area. If I can, I'll clean up some of the other stuff, but this is just going to be the bare minimum because as terrible as this looks, it shouldn't really impede performance that much. So I'm going to go look for a few new screws and some other little bits of hardware, and then I'll come back. Finding those suitable replacements did take a little while, but now I can clean off both of these contacts as well as this contact up here. And I'm just going to double check because I remember the way these went on. We had to test it with the wire on this side, so our powered wheels have to go on that side. Or well, pickup wheels, whatever you want to call them. Alright, perfect. That front truck looks like it should be on fairly well. Now to do the same for the rear. Alright, before we go putting this whole thing back on, I do just want to put on this one wire, and I want to test out this tender briefly to make sure it actually picks up power. So I just took the brief opportunity to test, and this tender does actually pick up power, and it works with the engine. It is kind of at a slanted angle, so I might need to try bending these trucks over just a little bit. But overall, I think this is actually working much better than I thought it would. This tender itself might also be a little warped, so it is leaning a little bit. Again, this will not be a perfect engine, but it'll work. So I think we can set this tender aside until it's time to actually rewire this whole thing back up. I also didn't mention the drawbar that I have. I have a spare. The original is completely mangled, so we're not going to be reusing that. So I believe it's time now to start with all the tasks I want to do to the engine, starting with a basic cleanup. So immediately, it does look like this is some sort of like smoke unit setup. I believe all that needs to be done is I could just rip that off. It doesn't even look like it was soldered in place. And then I've got to figure out how to get this thing out. So I think I'm going to grab myself a pair of tweezers, and we can see if we will be able to pull this out. I don't know if I'll be able to find them, but I might as well try these needle nose pliers. I think they're going to be just small enough to fit in here and pull it out. Perfect. So I think what I'm going to try and do is I want to pull as much of this whole smoke stuff out of here as possible. Which I know it sounds ridiculous, but I don't like smoke units. So I want to get all of that element out of the thing, and I want to have this completely detached from being any sort of smoke unit. I think I will pull this part out too. And then that should leave this to just look like a basic funnel. I don't know if I've said this enough, but I'm not a huge smoke unit person. I'm going to see if I can pull this up to a height that I like. I think right about there is going to be the appropriate height to have this funnel at. And now we have nothing left of that smoke unit. I get that some of you like smoke units, and some of you, like me, really don't like them. It's a personal thing. I just don't like the risk of having smoke coming from these things because you have the risk of a fire, and also I just don't think smoke in HO looks all that great. So I just personally either disable it or completely remove it like that. So now that that task is done, I believe I can just work on the remaining chassis of this engine, give this thing some fresh oil. Then all we will have left to do is remove this wire, replace it with this new one that we cut to length, and then we can go test this thing out. So I'm going to stop talking unless I come across something interesting, and we're just going to give this a basic cleanup and some fresh oil. I said I wasn't going to say anything, but if you look closely, there is so much baked on and dried grease in here that this is just kind of ridiculous. So I'm just going to continue cleaning this thing out, but this might take a little bit longer than I expected it to. Alright, I'm just going to test this whole thing out before we put it back together, make sure everything seems like it'll run fine before we go wiring and doing any more work to the engine. Alright, while I was off camera, I did test it and it seems like everything is in pretty good order. I did stick in some neodymium magnets and that seemed to help. And while I was off camera, I also cut and stripped this wire to where I need it. So, all that I should have left to do is to unsolder this old wire, tin this new wire, and solder on the brand new wire. Alright, well that may not be the prettiest wiring in the world, that should in fact work. So now all I've got to do is mess with this whole front end a little bit, put the shell back on, install our new drawbar, and then I think that's going to be it for restoring this thing and we can go test it. Alright, now that that's all put back together after that very lengthy restoration, let's see if all that work paid off. Alright, so I've got the 040 all set up on the tracks. Let me see if I can get this thing to go. That actually seems pretty good. And this is at a really low setting on my controller too, so that's actually quite a good slow speed. This is at like 40% power, which I believe I'm gonna guess is somewhere around 6 volts. And at higher speeds, this thing seems to run pretty fine too. So let me take it back over to my desk and we will close out this ambitious restoration.
So, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this ambitious restoration.